This is not the kind of sermon I generally like to preach. I've got the way that I do things. I like to take the text that's there, find out what the text says, and then what nobody else in the world calls it this, no other preacher calls it, is just my weirdness. I like to put handles on whatever it is, give you some kind of metaphor, some kind of illustration to help you take whatever that principle is and carry it with you with those handles. But in Mark chapter 13, it's something different, and so I'm not trying to put any handles on anything. I'm not trying to give you any metaphors. This is just straight teaching through Mark chapter 13. And the reason we're doing this way is because Jesus was giving his disciples instructions that they needed to know about what was going to happen, things that they were worried about, things that they were concerned about, and he just stopped. And Mark writes everything else. We've talked about how Mark writes in sandwiches. He puts the main idea, and then he fills in details about the main idea, and then he repeats the main idea, and we've talked about that a bunch. But in Mark chapter 13, he doesn't do that. He just kind of takes a break from the literary communication style that he uses and says, I'm just going to teach you what you need to know. And what Jesus is teaching about is the end times. And as we talked about last week, we should not be obsessed with end times events. This should not be our main focus of study, but it is something that we need to be aware of. And the cool thing about what Mark did is Matthew and Luke both talk about this, and they give a ton, well, not a ton, but they give a lot more details. Revelation covers a lot of this stuff, and there's all kinds of details, and there's dragons, and there's women giving birth, and there's all kinds of stuff. But when Mark communicates to us what Jesus said, he says this is the minimum that you need to know as believers about those things. And what he does in the first half of the chapter, he says, all these things that you're panicking about or going to panic about are not signs of the end times. So stop panicking about those things. He said, nations going to war, nations collapsing is not a sign of the end times. Because that's what nations do, right? Rome, from our Western point of view, Rome was the most powerful empire at the time. We think about them controlling the whole world. Don't ask anybody in China about that, but from our perspective, Rome controlled the whole world. And they thought at that time, as Jesus was saying this, like, there's no way that Rome will ever fall. And yet Rome fell. The British Empire, the sun never set on the British Empire. They controlled the world through their economy and through their navy. And what are they now? I mean, it's a good place to go, and they have a few ships left, I guess, but they're not what they were. And so from the perspective of people living in the times, living in those places, my country's fallen apart. That means the end is here. And Jesus says, that is not what that means. Nations fight, nations fall. That is not a sign of the end times. He says there will be natural disasters. And you will think that these natural disasters are a sign of the end because your whole world is devastated by this natural disaster. There will be earthquakes. There will be famines that are caused by big droughts. There's all these things going to happen. And you're going to think, Jesus must be about to come back. And he says, this is not a sign of the end times. This is just a thing that happens. Natural disasters happen. So there'll be wars and rumors of wars. He said there'll be earthquakes and there will be famines. He said people are going to pop up and tell you that they're me. And you're going to think, oh, the end is here because Jesus has come back. We talked last week about Christ An-san-young, the Korean janitor who realized he was Jesus and stopped being a janitor and was suddenly a very wealthy cult leader. And it's funny how that worked out for him. But we'll have people that pop up and say, I'm Jesus. And Jesus says, when I come back, you're going to know it. Okay, nobody's going to have to convince you this Korean janitor is me. That's not how this is going to work. When you see people claiming to be me, unless the other stuff I've talked about has happened, that's not me. And then he said, here's what you want to look for to know that the end is starting. And he references Daniel, where Daniel talks about a 7-week peace treaty, or 7-year peace treaty with Israel and her enemies. He talks about the abomination of desolation, which is a pagan sacrifice on the altar. And he talks about a person who is an abominable person, that is somebody who's sacrilegious and idolatrous offering that sacrifice. He said, when you see the abomination of desolation, when you see this thing happening, then you know that things are kicking off. Okay? So we talked last week about what Jesus said. He said that, okay, all these other things, stop panicking. Okay? Every time there's a political upheaval in your nation, that may be the center of your world, but it is not the center of God's world. Stop panicking about disasters. Stop panicking about these other things thinking the end is here. You want to know when the end is here? Jesus says that these things kick off with a 7-year peace treaty, kicks off with a sacrifice on the Jewish altar of a pagan sacrifice by a person that should not be there. And we know that because the temple's not there currently, that what we're also looking for is the construction of the temple. And that's where we left it. Because Jesus said, this is not a sign of the end. And he said, this is the sign to look for. And then he spends the rest of the chapter telling us what we should do, what we should look for, and what we should do in response to that. And it's funny how much of end times prophecy is like connecting all the dots, and you've got the serial killer yarn board, and you're doing all these things. But for Jesus, he said, no, this is one thing. You're looking for this one thing. We got one verse. Don't get obsessed with everything else. Focus on this one thing. And then he's going to go through and tell us other things that are going to happen after that we need to be prepared for. So, starting in Mark chapter 13, verse 21, we're going to jump in and just read the words of Jesus and talk about them for the rest of this chapter. Mark chapter 13, verse 21. He said, okay, when you see these things, then, right? This word then tells us that this first section kicks off the next section. It's an if-then clause for all the engineers out there. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead people astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard, I have told you all things before. This sounds like he's repeating what he said before, right? Because he said other people will rise up and say that they're Jesus. But he doesn't say here, other people, I'm going to fall over on this stage. He doesn't say other people will rise up and say, I'm Jesus. What does he say? He said, false Christs and false prophets will rise up. Now, Jesus is the Christ, so we think about it the same thing. But what he's saying is a little bit different. The word Christ just means Messiah. It's the Greek word for the Jewish word Messiah. It means one sent from God to rescue his people. That's what it is. It's the Savior. And he doesn't say other people are going to rise up and say, I am Jesus. But he says that other people will rise up and say, Jesus wasn't the Christ, I am. There's a difference. One person tries to take on the mantle of Jesus, and the other attacks Jesus and takes on the mantle of the Messiah for themselves. And whenever he says this, it's really easy for us to kind of skip over this and say he's done this before. But this is actually a miniature version of what he says, what we're told in Revelation about some bigger things. And Jesus doesn't go into detail there. He just says there are going to be people who rise up and say that they're the Messiah and that I'm not. And there will be false prophets that come along that will teach you things or say things and do things that will make you think they're from God, and they'll speak against me. And we can look at this and we can see throughout history there have been false prophets, or I can't put on the quotes on false prophets. There we go, put that in the right spot. False prophets who rise up and say things. What is Muhammad called? He's called the prophet. And he said, what did he say? He said, all the things in the Old Testament and New Testament are true, but they've been corrupted, and I've come to correct it. Joseph Smith, the prophet of the Latter-day Saints movements, of the Mormons, what did he say? He said, all the things in the Old Testament and New Testament are true, but I've got some extra information that will help you understand this. And Jesus said, look, there are going to be other people that come along and say things, and they're going to rise up and they're going to perform signs and wonders that make you think they're telling the truth. And that's happened over and over. We've had other people that have risen up and said, I'm the Messiah. That has not really played out. But so there's these small things that happen. Not that you can call either of these movements small, but these are these small things that happen. But then also we're told in Revelation that this is going to happen a final time, and this is probably what Jesus is referring to. First of all, the Christ. We've got in Revelation chapter 13, I'm going to start halfway through verse 1 because that first half of verse 1 doesn't do anything for us for this sermon. It says, I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. We could go into a lot of information there about lion's feet, or was it, we got leopard body, and we got bear feet and lion mouth. And we could go into all of that and talk about which countries do these people. We're not doing that. All I want to point out to you is that there is someone that rises up, and we know him as the Antichrist, that rises up, And he is given authority from Satan. This dragon is just a reference to Satan. That he rises up and is given authority and power from Satan. And with that authority and power, he's going to do things, but he's also going to do things that makes it seem like he's fulfilling prophecy from the Old Testament, that he is the Christ. Verse 3, one of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. That this person was injured in a way that either it seemed like he died or seemed like he was about to die, but miraculously he healed. Let me clarify, this was not an ear wound, okay? I'm not saying that this was an ear. I told Brittany more like, this is a terrible time for me to preach this sermon. a mortal wound, not a shot through the ear. If it had been a couple inches different direction, this would be a really awkward sermon, okay? But he receives a mortal wound, and he's healed from it. And what is that? Well, Jesus, what is the ultimate sign of Jesus' authority? He died and then came back to life. And what will this Messiah that rises up, this false Messiah, say? Who say, well, you just heard about that, and that was a myth that they spelled, but I actually fulfill all these prophecies. I've actually received a mortal wound and lived. And if you look back at the prophecies of Isaiah, I fulfill all of those. And what the Antichrist will do is he will rise up and he will take Scripture and attempt to fulfill it himself and reject Jesus at the same time. And Jesus says, you got to be careful, because his goal is to deceive the entire world, but also to deceive you. So when you see somebody rising up saying, I'm the Messiah, and here's how you know that I'm the Messiah, and it's a rejection of Jesus, then you know that you need to be really careful around that person. The response of the world will be that they worship Satan because of this. The dragon is Satan. They worship Satan because he had given his authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, who is like the beast, who can fight against us? And this is going to be a direct parallel to Jesus and the Father, right? Because Jesus leads people to worship the Father, and we also worship Jesus because he is one with the Father. And he'll say, you got that wrong, but you misplaced who that was. See, I have received a mortal wound, and I've been healed. And he left, or he died, or something. Who knows what happened to him? But I am still here. And you need to worship my Father, but I and the Father are one. You got to worship me too. And it will be so similar that many will be deceived, even some of those who are followers of Jesus. They worship the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, who is like the beast and who can fight against it? So when Jesus says that there will be people coming claiming to be him, and they're not him, he's specifically talking about people saying, I am Jesus. But he's also saying there will be people who will reject me and claim to have the position that I have. And you need to watch out for those people. Then he says there will also be prophets come up. And we've talked about Muhammad. We've talked about Joseph Smith. There are other prophets that are going around throughout the world, doing all kinds of stuff. But specifically, there is a prophet that rises up to assist the Antichrist. In Revelation 13, verse 11, this is just a few verses down from what we just read. I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose mortal wound was healed. Brother Roger teaches about this a lot more than I do, and so if you want to get questions about what the horns mean and how those things work, I can answer them. You can ask him. We can do that. But that's not what I'm doing today. What we're focusing on is that to assist the Antichrist, this false Messiah, a prophet rises up who will be able to do things and exercise power in support of the Antichrist. And Jesus says, you got to watch out for this stuff. Many people will be deceived because, in verse 13, it performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. He will lead in worship of the false Messiah. So what does Jesus say? He says, don't panic about all this other stuff. When you see the abomination of desolation, when you see this stuff happening, then you start watching for this other stuff. And John gives us a whole lot more detail than what Jesus does. But he says there will be two primary enemies that are going to rise up against you, and you got to watch out for them because their whole goal is to deceive you. Verse 24 and 25, these are really a summary of a lot of what happens in Revelation. And Jesus is like, you just need 2 verses of this for right now. In those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. So, Revelation, John sees all these visions of things that are going to happen, and there are stars falling, and there's questions about, are these actual stars falling? Are they angels falling? What's happening at different times? It is angels, and sometimes it's something else. And so he says there's going to be all kinds of stuff happening. Remember, he said back early in the chapter, signs in the sky, the things in the stars, these are not signs of the end. But when the end happens, there will be all these things that come to confirm it. But you got to have the first piece first. All of this stuff happens. Don't panic. When you start seeing this stuff happen, don't panic. I know this is coming. I know what's going to happen. I'm still in charge of the situation. Because in verse 26, when the fathers had enough of this, in verse 26, then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Now here's what's cool about this. We talked about the Chosen. Was it last week we talked about the Chosen just a little bit? I talked about some of the stuff there. I don't remember. But in that, you get this Jewish view of what the Messiah was supposed to be and their concern, and you see that throughout the gospel too, but you can really see it in the TV show. You can see what they're expressing there. Their goal, their expectation of him was to come with authority, to come and to conquer, and conquer his enemies and defeat his enemies, and he comes in with an army, right? The whole time they're looking for an army. Rome, the entire time that Jesus is doing his thing, thinks that he's starting a rebellion. The Jewish leaders are upset because he's going to come in and he's going to be king, and he's opposed to them, so he's not going to put them in positions of authority. Their whole expectation was Jesus to show up with an army and fight, to come in power and in glory, and he doesn't do it. When he comes in, he rides in humble on a donkey. But when he comes back, he will not come back as a baby who needs his diapers changed. He will not come back poor. He will not come back on a mission of peace. But when he comes back, he will come back to do business. He will come in power and glory. And all those prophecies that the Jews expected him to fulfill in the first time that he was here, he will fulfill in the second time. The first time is about mercy and patience. The second time is about getting business done. He will come in clouds with great power and great glory. Matthew describes this as like his coming is like lightning coming from one side of the sky to the other side of the sky. What does that mean? It means that when Jesus comes back, it doesn't matter where you're standing, you will know it's Jesus coming back, right? Nate and Lindsay live about a mile from us. If there's lightning, we can both see it from our house, different places. We know where that is, even though there's distance separating us. Depending on the lightning, David and Carla live a bunch of miles away from us over here. And we can see lightning in the same spot, and there's no question, even though there's distance about what's going on. When Jesus comes back, it will not be as a Korean janitor that you have to be convinced is Jesus. But when he comes back, everyone will know who it is that's coming. Because he will come back with power and glory. He will come with angels. He will come in the sky. And what he will do is he will gather his elect from the four winds, all those who have trusted in him, who've said, you know what? I cannot save myself. If the standard of judgment is good enough, I've fallen short. When God judges me, I've sinned. I've fallen short of that standard. And if I've only sinned one sin, I'm still going to be found guilty. But what Jesus says is that anyone who will trust in him, that he will imbue his righteousness to them. And so that if you call out to Jesus and say, Lord, I can't do this on my own. I need you. That he will offer you his standing before God. And whenever he comes back, or if you die before he comes back, when you stand before God, you're not judged based on your actions, but his actions. And all of those that's alive at the time that happens, when he comes back, will be gathered together from him. He'll not leave them in the midst of all this destruction and all this persecution, but will gather them together from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. And that's what he tells us. He says that's what you need to know. Don't panic. Bad stuff's going to happen. Doesn't mean it's end times. It just means you live in a sinful, fallen world. When this specific event happens, then you know it's time to prepare because things are going to be bad. And at that time, it's going to get real bad for you. And you're going to be scared because there are going to be people doing miracles saying that Jesus is not the Son of God, that they're the Son of God. There will be disasters. There will be scary stuff happening in the world. But don't panic. Right? Got any Hitchhiker's Guides to the Galaxy fans? Right on the cover of this Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is 2 words, don't panic. This is what Jesus tells us. I don't know if Douglas Addison got that from there or not, since I just made it up and it's not in Scripture, probably not. But you got these 2 words, don't panic. Because regardless of how bad it gets, this is not a surprise. This is not something that is out of control. This is something that God has allowed for a specific purpose. And He allows difficulty now. He allows persecution now. He allows all these things to happen now. For what purpose? Well, we read in that first half of the chapter that what God is doing is making it so that He is satisfied that the gospel has been preached to all nations. And that just means that we're going to have to endure some things while we're waiting on that. And when it happens, when He's satisfied, there will be 7 years that are really bad. And at the end of those 7 years, Jesus will come back, and that time will end. So don't panic. Right? You take your kid. Emily gets mad when I talk about the dentist, so I won't talk about the dentist. Let's say you're going to take your kid to get a shot. Although a dentist is a better example of this. Let's say you take your kid, you're going to take your kid to get a shot, right? And you tell your kid, hey, you're going to get a shot. And what do? They panic the whole time. They panic the whole time. And then they panic during the shot. And then they panic after the shot. That you have this time of panic. And what do you keep telling them? Like, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. This is for your good. It's going to be okay. And Jesus says, look, you're adults. I'm going to treat you like adults. I'm not going to lie to you and say this is all going to be fine and we're going to the dentist, not dentist, I've got that on the brain. We're going to get a shot just to fill out some paperwork and it's no big deal and then we're secretly going to stab you while you're in there. Jesus is not leaving you in the dark, but He's saying, okay, you're adults. You need to understand this is going to be a rough time. Don't panic. Keep your head down and do the work. He says, in chapter 13, verse 28, from the fig tree learn its lesson. If you remember, Jesus just cursed a fig tree a couple of days ago. So when He starts bringing up fig trees, they're like, I don't know what He's going to do now. Chapter 13, verse 28, from the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that the summer is near. So also when you see these things taking place, you know that He is near at the very gates. Do you realize what that is? Like we can look at that and say, okay, we don't panic. The end times are going to be here. When we see the end times coming, when we see these specific events happening, then we know it's about to get bad. You could look at it that way, but read what He actually said in verse 29. So also, when you see these taking place, you know that He is near. Not that the end is near, but that He is near. That what we're looking for is not the end. What we're looking for is Him. So hold fast. Because when you start to experience these things, understand, He is near. What is the book of Revelation? I told you last week, it's not Revelations. Because it is not revelations of end times, but it is the revelation of Jesus. The point of this is a message of hope. And He says, look, you people in Arkansas understand that sometimes in January you have warm days. That's when you get the tornadoes, right? The warm days in January. You understand that just because it's a warm day in January does not mean that summer is here. That's not what that means. But when you see the trees starting to bloom, when you see the grass starting to grow, you know the summer has arrived. There will be lots of warm days, and there will be some cool days. Don't panic. But watch for the events that will tell you that Jesus is coming back. Now we get to the sticky part. Right? When we get to the sticky part, verse 30. Let's go into verse 30. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. It's sticky because I'm a plain reading of the text guy. I like whatever it says is what it means and don't really go deeper looking for other things. I want you to, whatever it says is what He means. But this one's a little harder to do that with because the plain reading of the text says to me, and I'm sure what the disciples thought was that they would be alive, or at least most of them would be alive when all these things took place. Okay? And if that's what it means, then we've got some serious misunderstandings or Jesus was wrong. So the question is, what does Jesus mean when He says this? Well, the word generation is one of those words, that the Greek word that's translated generation can mean a couple of different things. Could give us some indication. Let's see, the first thing that it could mean is generation could mean race of people. That's what it can refer to, that Greek word. And so some people think that what he's saying is that the Jews will survive, that regardless of the persecution that you endure, the Jews will survive, which would make sense for him to say that, because remember, this all started with him saying that the temple was going to be destroyed, that people were going to come in and attack them. It could mean race of people. And so he said, don't worry, there will be a remnant of Abraham's people that will still be alive when this happens. Some people think that it means that what he's saying is that the generation that's alive at the time that it starts will be alive whenever it finishes. And that what he's saying is this is another callback to saying that this is going to happen quickly, right? Because he said several times this is going to happen quickly. He said that if the Father had not shortened these days, that for the sake of the elect, that it would be really awful, but he did shorten them. And so there's 2 or 3 other references to it being a short period of time. And so some people think that what he's saying here is that this is going to be a short period of time. It's not going to go on for hundreds of years, this evil, but it'll happen quickly. The third way to look at this is that it's not really looking at the word generation, but looking at the phrase all these, and looking at the way that that's translated. And that all these does not all these, that's not the best translation of it, but rather the word all would be better. Or not all, that the word these would be better. Because we talked last week again about the dual fulfillment of prophecy. Like Jesus said, the abomination of desolation, and he quoted Daniel. But there was somebody that offered a pagan sacrifice a couple hundred years before this. And there's a lot of times, in fact, most of the time, that whenever there's a prophecy given, it's fulfilled twice. There's a near fulfillment and a far fulfillment. And so that what Jesus is saying is that the original question they asked, the temple going to be destroyed, that he was saying that the temple would be destroyed before the generation that was alive at that time died. I have always leaned more towards that one, that what he was saying is that they would be alive when the temple was destroyed. But the more I've studied this, I almost think that what he's saying is more that the people that are alive at the time, that it won't last more than one generation, that it'll be a short period of time. You can land wherever you want there, because I can't prove any of my views on this. But what I know is that Jesus died and rose again. What I know is that I believe Jesus is the only Son of God. I believe that the Bible is inerrant and true. And if Jesus said something that looks false, then it's probably my fault for not understanding rather than his fault for being wrong. You can do whatever you want to. But I'm going to lean towards Jesus saying that this is going to happen in a short period of time. Do whatever you want to with that. But this is what he says in verse 31. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Look, the world is going to end, right? There's going to be a day that if Jesus waited that long, that the sun would explode and destroy everything. And we think about these things that are permanent, that are just, we look at it as permanent. It doesn't matter what happens to me, this mountain is still going to be there. It doesn't matter what happens to me, that ocean is going to be there. You say, you look at those things that you think of as permanent, all of those things are temporary. But my word, what I say is not temporary. What I say will come true. What I say is trustworthy. Don't panic, because I know what's happening and I'm in charge. And then he says this in verse 32. This is another thing that I don't know. I wish he wouldn't said this way, but I don't know. Who knows? Verse 32, concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Father, nor the Son, but only the Father. He said, I don't even know when this is going to happen. Only the Father knows when this is going to happen. Only the Father knows. So don't waste your time trying to figure it out. You cannot cobble the clues together to figure out when it's going to happen. And anyone that says they can is lying to you for money. Okay? They're selling a book. They want you to buy a course. They want you to give a bigger offering because they figured it out. No one, Jesus says, I don't know, so stop trying to figure it out. Now that's the question is, how can Jesus not know something that the Father does? I've got a thought experiment that we can do, but I don't think we have time for it. I don't think it's really necessary. There are things that I don't understand about the relationship between Jesus, the Son of God, who is a third part of the Trinity, and God the Father and the Holy Spirit. There are things I don't understand about that. But I trust Jesus, and I trust what Jesus said about himself, and what he said was, the Father has not revealed this to me. I don't know the answer. Maybe it's because the Father is waiting on a specific event to happen. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. But the meaning of this is not to twist us up into knots about the Trinity and twist us up into knots about the relationship between the Father and the Son. The point of this is to tell us to stop obsessing over it, because you're not going to figure it out. Instead, do what he said, do your work, look for what he said to look for, and trust that he is in control. But be on guard and keep awake. Don't go to sleep on the job. Instead, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It's like a man going on a journey, and when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. You do not know when these events are going to happen. You do not know when this is going to kick off. You don't know what's going to trigger this. So do your work now. And he compares it to people that were left to manage a man's house while he went to go do something. And he gave them specific jobs to do. He said, when that guy comes back, you better be working. Because if you're not doing the job that he's given to do while you're gone, he's not going to be thrilled with you when you get back. Well, our kids, I just love where we're at with our kids. Our kids are old enough that we can leave them at home without a babysitter, right? And we can leave them at home. We're like, you know what? Y'all are driving us nuts. We're going to dinner. Figure it out. We'll be back. Make sure the kitchen's clean when we get back. And we give the kids freedom to do quite a bit of stuff while we're gone. You know, they can pretty much do whatever they want to as long as they don't burn the house down. They're supposed to eat. They're supposed to clean something up. And we say to do this job before you get back. And then we give them freedom while we go watch a movie or we go to dinner or we go to just get out of the house. But there are a few things more frustrating to me than when I leave them and give them the freedom of the house to do pretty much whatever they want to. And all I say, you've got to eat, and you've got to clean the kitchen, and you got to make sure your rooms are clean. That's all you got to do. And then you can do whatever you want to. There are few things more frustrating than when we come back and maybe we went to a movie and it's 9:30 or 10 o'clock, and we come in the house and we've let them stay up, let Beckham stay up late anyway, and we come in the house and we'll say, what are you doing? Go to bed. And Beck says, I haven't eaten. Like, it is 10 o'clock. What are you doing, man? It is 10 o'clock. I have not eaten. The time for eating has passed. When I come in and I've said, you can have complete freedom of whatever you want to do, I just ask you to do these few things. And the kitchen is a mess. We just had a great night. Britt and I are doing real well. And we come in and there's junk all over the countertop and the dishwasher is open and there's, what are you doing to me? Like, what? I gave you just a couple of jobs and complete freedom. What are you doing? And I got to ask, if your kids obeyed you while you're gone the way that you obeyed Jesus while he's gone, how much trouble would they be in? Because we've been given just a few jobs. We're supposed to share the gospel with people. We're supposed to gather together as a church and bear one another's burdens. We're supposed to be a good representatives of him in whatever it is that we do. Husbands are supposed to give themselves up for their wives. Wives are supposed to submit to and follow their husbands, which should be pretty easy if he's given up everything for you. We're supposed to do these few things. And what does he say in return? He's like, do whatever you want to. Go get the job you want to have. Most of the time, the job you want to have is fine. You want to go out, make your money, spend your money how you want to, live the life that you want to, get the house that you want to. Do those things. Go on vacations. Enjoy the freedom that I have given you. But I ask that you do just a few things. And I ask, if your kids obeyed you while you're gone, the way that you obey Jesus while he's gone, how much trouble would they be in? We've been given freedom. And what did Jesus say? He said, like, all this stuff that I'm telling you because it's like a man who went on a journey and he left his servants there to take care of things while he was gone, and they gave them complete run of the house to do whatever while he was gone. But he said, I want you to take care of these jobs while I'm gone. But instead he comes back and they've taken advantage of the freedom that they've given and have done none of the work. What would that be like when the boss comes home? And Jesus said, stay awake. Because you don't want Jesus to come back. You don't want these events to kick off, and you've not done any of the work that you're supposed to do. You are not prepared at all for what's supposed to happen. You've not prepared your kids at all for what's going to happen, that you know is going to happen. What will the response be? Jesus says, you want to know what you should do with this information? Not obsess. Not try to cobble together the details to predict the exact date of my return. But what should you do? Stay awake and do the work. Because I'm coming back. That should be our response. So let me just ask you a couple of questions. Are you panicking about the end because of events that are going around us right now? You see, there was an assassination attempt yesterday, right? It's been 40 years since that's happened. Well, at least one that got that far. 40 years, I don't think the shoe at George Bush counts. But we got 40 years since that happens. Are you panicking about that? You see some of the decisions that are being made in our country, and you're so focused on being American and what it is to be an American and living in America that you look at that and you see what's happening in our country and you say, the end is here. You see persecution around the world and you say, the end is here, and you're starting to panic. Because if that's your response, you're doing it wrong. Jesus said, you don't have to panic. Trust me to take care of this. Are you watching? Are you watching for what he's looking for? Not watching the news 24 hours a day, but recognizing the couple of things that he said to look for and watching for those. And then taking care of your business the rest of the time. Are you watching? Because he didn't give us this information so we wouldn't watch, but so that we would watch. If you're panicking, stop. If you're not watching, start. And thirdly, I just want to ask, are you awake? Are you awake and aware? Are you doing the work that you're supposed to be doing? If Jesus came back yesterday, if all this kicked off yesterday, let's say Jesus, we did some things in a little bit different order and things didn't go down the way that I think they're going to, but more the way Dennis thinks they're going to, and that happened, and Jesus came back yesterday, how would you feel about what Jesus found you doing when he got here? After the way that you've talked to people this week, after the opportunities to share the gospel that you've skipped this week, if the way that you've treated people this week, how would you feel about his timing if he came back yesterday? And I just want to say, if you don't feel great about that, Jesus' response to you is to wake up, to live your life with the expectation of his return, to enjoy the freedom that you've been given, but also to fulfill the responsibilities that he's given you. Prepare, watch, don't panic, stay awake. Because the point of this entire thing was Jesus saying this: when you see these things happening, you can have hope. Not hope because of the persecution, not hope because of the destruction, not hope because of the Antichrist, but hope because these things mean I'm about to come back. So wake up, have hope, do your work, and more importantly than anything else, if you are trusting in yourself to be good enough, you are trusting in yourself to stand before God and say, I tried my best, wake up, okay? Because it doesn't matter how many people you didn't kill during your murder trial. It matters about the one person you did kill. The one murder is enough to make you guilty. And there is one sin alone, any sin, is enough to make you guilty before God. So stop trusting in yourself. Don't panic about these things, but recognize that you need to be prepared and cry out to him for rescue today. Would you stand with me as we pray? Our Heavenly Father, we come before you today, and I'm so grateful that you've given us this, Lord. And Mark wrote this almost exactly the way that I would want it written. There's some confusing things in here. There are some things that I have questions about. But all in all, you didn't get us confused with a ton of details that we could speculate about, but rather you told us exactly what we needed to know, Lord. And as we look at this, I ask that we would pay attention to what it is that you've told us. I ask that we would pay attention to what it is that you've told us to do, and that we would stay awake, that we would watch, that we wouldn't panic, but that we would prepare. Not prepare by stocking up on canned goods, but prepare by raising our children to know and love and follow you. By sharing the gospel that when we're given the opportunity. By fulfilling our responsibilities as churches to bear one another up, to encourage one another, to gather together for the sake of doing those things, Lord. So that when you come back, you won't find us perfect, but you will find us awake and waiting with hope for the return that you're bringing. For any of those today, Lord, who are not prepared, not in the sense of not doing well with their kids or not sharing the gospel, but are not prepared because they're planning to stand before you on their own merit, Lord, I ask that they would see the inefficacy of that. That they would see that they're not going to be found innocent because of their effort, but that they are guilty and that they need your forgiveness and your righteousness. I ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.